There is an old Southern gospel song that goes, "So high I can't get over it, so low I can't get under it, so wide I can't get around it." Today's gospel is something we cannot get over, we cannot get under, and we cannot get around. We must directly confront what God intends for us, while admitting we'd rather have things our way, and that we often bend our perception of God's will to accommodate our wants and not His. Jesus' words today charge us with recreating the world in our own image, rather than respecting it as being made in God's image. Jesus speaks of the hardness of our hearts, which reminds us that we are at times unteachable by God because we simply do not want to learn from Him. In our gospel, Jesus is talking about divorce, but in doing so, He is talking about a larger problem: our desire to be God. Mark the evangelist states clearly the mind of Jesus. We are not to divorce, and furthermore, someone who divorces and remarries commits adultery. We cannot get over it, under it, or around it. Divorce was rampant in Jesus' time, just as it is in our own. Although I saw a recent study indicating that the divorce rate has actually dropped of late, since on the whole, couples are waiting until they are older and more settled until they get married. But nonetheless, it was a hot topic in the time of Jesus. And there are records of arguments about the various grounds for being able to get a divorce. Using this controversial issue of the day, some Pharisees sought to force Jesus to take sides in their argument, thereby setting at least one religious party against Him. But Mark, in his gospel, wants to tell us about more than just divorce. Twice the Pharisees asked about what is lawful or what is allowed concerning divorce. Jesus ignores their questions regarding the law and speaks instead about what God intends and what God commands. The Pharisees were concerned solely about their own rights and with what they could get by. Jesus, on the other hand, was concerned with the will of God. Jesus shifted the pettiness and the legalism of the Pharisees to a higher ground. Rather than getting caught up in human laws and exceptions, Jesus forces the Pharisees, and indeed all of us, to ponder not what we want, but to ponder what God made and what God intended. All of creation is in fact an act of love on God's part. Creating the world and loving all of its creatures into existence is part of a deeper truth. In order to accomplish the salvation of humankind, God entered into creation through His Son, Jesus Christ. As brothers and sisters with Him, we too can experience this same union with God. The creation story is the basis for Jesus' teaching on marriage in the gospel. It expands on such understanding of God's ultimate act of love for all creation, becoming human Himself. Our first reading from the book of Genesis points us to precisely that. Man and woman share in a single act of creation, are equal, and are joined together as one. Jesus points out that marriage is not a human institution to be left to our own whims. Rather, it is something that comes from God's very act of creation itself. The deeper point comes as Jesus goes on to acknowledge not so much our inability to keep God's will, but our unwillingness to follow it. Christ reminds us of the bond established between man and woman as found in the Genesis account, and he taught the value of permanence and fidelity in marriage. What Jesus is saying points us to why we as the church believe that marriage is in fact a sacrament. We find the answer to our deepest human need, the need for true love, in the sign that God has given us, the union of man and woman in marriage. It is proof that God has planted faithful love at the heart of what it means to be human and has blessed it. This great sacramental sign, revealed in married couples all around us, in you yourselves and in those others that we know and love, is indeed to be celebrated. Marriage, as envisioned in the book of Genesis, is not the only thing, however, created by God that we routinely ignore, but also the very things of this earth. God has designed creation for our use, making us its stewards, not its owners. He reminds us that we are to care for the earth as we would care for any precious thing that belongs to another. In addition to being responsible stewards of his creation, God instructs us to live the truth by serving others. God wants us to heal the wounds of sin and division. God intends that we serve the needs of the kingdom. God expects, indeed, God commands, that we keep holy the Sabbath day. In all of these things, we are called to love one another as Christ has loved us. But so often, our first question is, what is it going to cost me? Jesus' explanation of God's intentions was clear, precise, and without ambiguity. Something that we cannot get over, get under, or get around. May we have the courage and the strength to pay attention to what we as God's people have ignored for far too long.